All across America and around the world, this is Veterans Radio. This is Veterans Radio.
Welcome to Veterans Radio. I am Jim Fausone. I'm the officer of the deck today. We've got some great programs for you. We always want to remind you you can find more about Veterans Radio at its Facebook site or at the web, veteransradio.org, where we're on the web 24/7. You can find a lot of our podcasts there as well. We post new ones every Tuesday, so you can get a new story, a new interview, something you didn't know before by going to veteransradio.org. And before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors. First up, we want to thank National Veteran Business Development Council, nvbdc.org. It was established to certify both service-disabled and veteran-owned businesses. You'll find out how they can help your business by going to nvbdc.org. We want to thank Legal Help for Veterans. Legal Help for Veterans fights for veterans' disability rights all across the nation. You can reach them at 800-693-4800 or on the web at legalhelpforveterans.com. And finally, PuroClean. PuroClean is the paramedics of property damage. It provides water damage remediation, flood water removal, fire and smoke damage remediation, mold removal, biohazard cleanup. It also has a focus on veteran franchisees. You can learn more about them by going to puroclean.com. We want to welcome today, and it's a special privilege, to have Medal of Honor recipient Clint Romesha on the line with us. Clint, welcome to Veterans Radio.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for having me today.
Well, this is a real honor for us. We try to tell veteran stories and have been fortunate over the 20 years we've been doing this to talk to a lot of Medal of Honor recipients. And so we're going to talk with Clint today about himself, a little bit about the battle where his heroics got recognized, but more about kind of what it means, what's involved with being a Medal of Honor recipient. Clint received his Medal of Honor for his actions during the Battle of Kamdesh in 2009 during the war in Afghanistan at a place called Combat Outpost Keating. We'll get into a little bit more of that, but Clint, let's start with how did a nice guy like you end up in the U.S. Army?
So for me, I mean, you could partially say it was kind of a family business with my grandfather being an Army guy, combat engineer, World War II. My dad was Vietnam infantryman, did a couple of tours in Vietnam. Both my older brothers had served, so when it kind of came time to graduation, part of me wants to say I did it because of the family tradition. And that was part of it, but part of it too was it was 1999. There wasn't a lot going on in the world, and I just wanted to go out and kind of see the world. I wanted to kind of give back to the country, do my time. I was thinking I'll do 4 years, I'll get some college money, and we'll go from there, which has always kind of impressed me with the great men and women that served after September 11th. Because like I said, when I joined, we were at peace. And all those kids that, like I said, put that uniform on afterwards, like they knew what they were getting into. And they willingly made that volunteer choice to go do that.
Well, you graduated high school in California, and I have a note here that you loved playing ice hockey. I mean, you kind of had the regular upbringing of an American kid, it sounds like, right?
Yeah, we grew up, like I said, in a tiny little town in Northern California. We're ranchers and farmers. That's what he did going to school. Before going to school every day was they had 3 cows to milk, and that was just, we raised alfalfa, and that was just kind of that. The great thing about being in the military, my first exposure was meeting guys from like New York City and the big cities of from around our country. And, that's what I always kind of talk to the kids about is that there's so many different walks of life that you get exposed to in the military. And this is a great and big country. You kind of, as you're growing up, you think you're on that little island and that's the only thing there is out there. But to get that exposure to it, is one of those just processes of life that I think everybody should be kind of privy to.
Well, I think at times, Clint, people think those of you who's received the Medal of Honor for the heroics under such combat situations must have grown up with a Superman's cape on, and you were just a superhero waiting for your time to come. But as I say, you were just sort of a regular guy. You certainly never viewed yourself in that light, I suspect.
No, I wasn't like I grew up being the captain of a football team. Shoot, when I graduated high school, I mean, I was all of 5'5" and about 110 pounds. So, and like I said, I can dig fence line and I can milk cows, and that's the background I came from. It wasn't anything super spectacular.
So you did 12 years in the Army, came out as a staff sergeant. Let's talk about a few of your deployments before the final deployment, if you will, in Afghanistan. Tell us a little bit about Kosovo and Iraq a couple of times, and military life, because along the way you get married and all of those other things happen as well. So set this up for us about where you were experienced and mentally prepared for that final campaign in Afghanistan.
It goes back to, if it wasn't for all the other things I'd went through prior to the Afghanistan deployment, I mean, we can always play the who knows or what ifs, but I do think, like I said, my first deployment was Kosovo back in '99. I said, when I graduated high school, went to my dad, told him I was wanting to join the Army. I was 17 at the time, and he told me no, because he's like, no, I'm not going to sign for you.
He wasn't smart enough to say, go to the Air Force?
Well, first thing he said was, if you're going to join the military, go get a job that's not combat arms. Get something that you can do after you take the uniform off, because there's not a lot of opportunities for combat arms guys with direct skill transfers and stuff. And
so, like once again, you didn't listen to Dad, did you?
I don't think many of us kids really understand what our parents are truly trying to tell us until we strike out on our own and kind of. I've always loved the discipline of failure. Nothing motivates you more than failing at something to teach you a good lesson. But back then he told me, I'm not going to sign for you, because maybe not tomorrow and maybe not in 20 years, but if you put the uniform on, you might have to go and do and see things that you shouldn't have to go do and see. Like I said, Dad and Grandpa never shared their kind of combat experiences when they were in. All the stories they shared was always about their buddies and the camaraderie and the shenanigans they'd get into. But, they always kept very tight-lipped and never would open up about their times in combat. So as a young kid, especially growing up in the 80s and 90s, you got this idea of what war is, and, the exposure of Desert Storm, Desert Shield, that was in and out, relatively quickly, and our technology really kind of triumphed. So when I first got on my deployment, going to Kosovo, that's where it first kind of sparked what my dad was talking about, going and doing and see things that no one should have to go do and see. At that time in Kosovo, with the massive genocide going back and forth between the Serbs and the Albanians and Milosevic and all that kind of chaos going on over there, it really put in perspective for me, excuse me, like what I took for granted growing up in this country. I used to complain growing up in that tiny town in Northern California, like the nearest McDonald's was over an hour away.
Oh my God, how could you live, right?
I know how tragic, how just, my life was so rough and tough. And all of a sudden I'm 18 years old and I'm in a foreign country where we literally are escorting either Albanians through Serbian towns or Serbians through Albanian towns to go get fuel for their tractors so they can farm, so they can provide enough food just to survive a winter. Because if they didn't have a military escort, they'd typically get attacked and killed trying to go, from one town to the next that wasn't either, Albanian or Serbian. And so that, I just put it in perspective right away. It's like, man, what kind of a punk kid have I been complaining about McDonald's is over an hour away growing up. And there's literally people living on this earth that, if you don't have a military escort, you can't even go get fuel for your tractor to plow your field, to keep your family alive for a winter. So that's, and a lot of that was peacekeeping operations back then too. So it wasn't direct, combat for us. But like I said, without kind of that realization of, I think we forget because we do live pretty comfortable in America. So it's very easy to forget how much evilness and nastiness and just suffering is going on around the world.
Well, it had to replay itself when you went to a couple of deployments to Iraq. Tell us about that.
So the 2 deployments to Iraq, my first one was at kind of 2004, 2005 timeframe. So very much still very kinetic over there, just after kind of the initial shock and awe and the initial kickoff in 2003. Things had, obviously settled down some by then, but we weren't direct fighting at that time. Saddam's army, they'd been pretty much disbanded, but there was still very much hot and heavy. And I was one of the lucky souls that I came out of second ID out of Korea that actually put together a brigade and deployed us from Korea to Iraq on the first deployment that I went on. Like I said, that really was, in my mind, it was like I was actually getting ready to get out of the Army at that point. I had a guaranteed return assignment coming back to Fort Irwin, and I volunteered to go with the unit. And my colonel, because I was a gunner on his tank at the time, he kind of told me, he's like, Clint, you got a guaranteed return assignment. Fort Irwin's TRADOC, you can go back there and get out of the Army in 2 years and you never have to see a day in combat. But for me, it was like, well, that's what I signed up to do. I felt like I was kind of not checking all the blocks of military service, that we had a war going on, and how could I serve and not actually go when I had buddies that I'd lost at that point from my previous units, and guys that I knew through basic training that were injured, and it felt selfish not to volunteer to want to go. And like I said, that first deployment was still very kinetic, trying to take the fight to the enemy, but yet it opened my eyes too. Like, you think you have an idea of what combat is. It's just, you have this kind of fantasy that it's always heroic and just glorious, and everything's, just over the top, and good will always triumph. And as long as you're, the best, no one will ever get hurt. And the reality of war and combat on that first one very quickly sunk in. It's like, nope, everybody's vulnerable. You can have the best, this, that, and the other, but sometimes it's not your day, and the enemy is they're going to be thinking, and they're trying to do bad things to us. So we got to be on our toes. And that's when I very quickly got into the mindset that, you want to you're going to take your guys over. And the reality is you can't bring them all home.
But obviously that's what you're working at the goal on. And you did a number of training programs. Again, this is all background to sort of set up the activities of that day at the outpost. But you had training in long-range reconnaissance courses, advanced leader course, air assault training, cavalry scout, all of that building the blocks of the soldier that you were becoming and were going to need to be on that day. Did it feel like you were adding building blocks?
Every step of the way. I said, even from the first Iraq to the second Iraq deployment, those were 2 totally different deployments in the way you had to have your mindset and the way your tactics worked. Like I said, the first one was still very kinetic. We were really going after the bad guys directly. And then come the time of the second one, of course, that's the 2006 to 8, and that's more the surge, and that's more hearts and mind and more rebuilding. So then you got to kind of shift gears that, you still got bad guys wanting to take you out, but it's also about, let's get these guys back on their feet so they can take care of their own country, so we don't have to be here for, forever and eternity. And so it gives you kind of the perspective of when you need to kind of come down on the sledgehammer, and then the perspective of sheathing your saber and having some restraint to understand that you got to build things back up after you kind of tear them down and rip them apart. And every time in between, all the training between those deployments all just are like little Lego pieces that you continue to add on to make, something more than just scattered chaos.
As I say, all of this builds to who you were on that day in October of 2009 at Outpost Keating in eastern Afghanistan. To set this up a little bit, Combat Outpost Keating may have been the worst location in the entire Afghan theater for a base or an outpost. It was down in a valley. All the high ground looking down on it was just rife with being positioned so that the Taliban could lob rockets, grenades, shots, what have you in. And on that particular day, a force of 300 Taliban insurgents attacked the base, which maybe had 50 guys in it. And quickly they infiltrated. And surprisingly, this 12-hour battle is filmed. A lot of it's filmed by the Taliban. So if you're interested in more of sort of what's going on and seeing some of that activity, it's really replayed in a couple of places for our veteran radio listeners. And we're talking to Clint Romesha, who received the Medal of Honor for his activities on that day at Camp Outpost Keating. There's a movie, The Outpost. He wrote a book, The Red Platoon. There are on YouTube really interesting interviews with Clint. There's a CBS Sunday Morning interview from about 8 years ago. So you can get a lot more about the actual battle itself. And actually, you'll see the changing beard of Clint Romesha. Clint, are you clean shaven today, or you have that great beard going?
I don't have the big beard going, but again, like I said, living up in North Dakota, I grow those things for survival come wintertime. They're not really a fashion statement.
But all joking aside, the U.S. Army ultimately closed Outpost Keating, considering it indefensible, which was, it was of no value to those of you who had to fight that day and got injured that day. Why don't you give us just a brief, this is what I want people to know that happened in that battle on that day?
The big things I always want people to know is it wasn't just me out there. Like I said, I had 50 other guys, 2 Latvians, fighting right there to my left and right. And 8 of those great men gave up their life that day. And if it wasn't for their sacrifice, one for the 50 other guys there, one for us working together, we wouldn't have came out. We would not have came out of that valley. It goes back to that teamwork, that brotherhood, that camaraderie. And the fight that day wasn't about politics. It wasn't about whether we should be in Afghanistan or not. It was literally about the love of your fellow warrior to your left and right, knowing that they had your back and would do everything, to include lay down their life to protect you, and you wanted to do the same for them. And the enemy that we fought that day was very proficient. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were veteran. They were seasoned. They wanted to come in and kill us because they hated everything we stood for. And we came out on top that day because of the great values that this country has instilled, I think, in every red-blooded American, of that loyalty, love, patriotism, duty, honor, respect, selfless service, courage, sacrifice. And it was because of all of those things that love and selfless sacrifice and courage trumped the hatred that we faced in the Taliban fighters that day.
I want to highlight one example of those qualities that you've just mentioned, and that is, as I said earlier, this is a 12-hour battle. You guys are running out of ammunition, food, water, everything, and you get to the point where the ammo depots some number of yards away, 100 yards away sort of thing, and you have to ask for volunteers to go with you and try to retrieve, get to that building, get some ammo distributed. is there anybody who's going to go with me? And the guys stand up. That's really got to be one of those spine-chilling moments in your life.
I've got a couple of very fond and just proud moments looking back on my life, and that hands down is one of them. To sit there and, essentially during the course of everything that has gone on, I'm sitting there and I go into the barracks and I'm asking for a group of volunteers. And like I said, I had 5 guys that stood up. It was Raz, Delaney, Danley, and Jonesy and Miller. And then I told them what I was wanting them to volunteer for. And essentially it was potentially a suicide mission. We are going to attack the enemy that's got the high ground, that's got us outgunned, outnumbered. They've got the initiative. Everything is stacked against us. And I like I said, I just said I just need volunteers, and you don't have to come if you don't want to. And each and every one of them just kind of looked at me and said, would follow you anywhere. And on a leader, on a personal note, to have another human being literally tell you, not just tell you, but go out and actually then go do it by their actions, that I will follow you anywhere. It was a moment that is just always going to be forever in my heart. The other spectacular thing that I got to be part of is that was month 3 into a 12-month deployment. And I got to watch for another 9 months, those men from Red Platoon pull up their big boy pants and continue the mission for 9 more months in country. Not a single one of the guys from Red Platoon said, that day was too tough on me, too much had happened. They didn't kind of play the woe is me and the pity party. Each one of those young men continued mission. And we didn't kind of take a knee and reflect truly on that day until we got back to the States 9 months after that. And that's another moment that is super proud of the leader, that you can get those guys after going through all of that to have the resiliency, the discipline, and the strength to sit there and say, you know what, we're going to finish this mission out, and we're going to finish it out right.
Now, this battle resulted in 9 soldiers, 8 American soldiers who were killed, and 9 soldiers were decorated with the Silver Star Medal. And on another part of the camp, in a whole different area that Clint had no idea what was going on over there, another Army Staff Sergeant, Ty Carter, was undergoing his own set of heroics, which resulted in the award of the Medal of Honor. But in your instance, Clint, who advanced the package for you to receive the Medal of Honor? I think the general public kind of doesn't understand how this comes about.
I'm still not 100% clear on that myself, because I'd gotten back from that deployment. I used that was going to be, like I said, my last enlistment in the Army. I figured at that point I'd been in about 10 years, or was going on 10 years right before that deployment. And I thought to myself, well, this will be my last kind of hoorah, and I'll do this last one and I'll get out and figure out what I'm going to grow up to be in life. So my last year in the Army, I did my transitioning stuff just like every other soldier, tried to work on my resume, tried my networking. And I stepped out the door on terminal leave in January 2011, going up to North Dakota to chase oil fields. And I worked up there for 2 years. And in that 2 years, I'd call and talk to some of my old troopers and stuff that were still in, and we'd have those conversations every so often, like, hey, Sir Rowe, did you ever get anything for that day on October 3rd? And I'd be like, I don't know. Stony Porter said something the day after or so about putting me in for a DSC, but I haven't heard a peep about it. And, Raz, you got your Silver Star. Well, yeah. It's like, well, you got your stuff. I made sure all the guys were taken care of before I took the uniform off. And that's what I'd kind of just gravitate back to. So it wasn't until, I said, 2 years later, I'm sitting there in the oil field and I get this call on my phone from a number I didn't recognize. But I went ahead and answered it. And on the other end of the line, all of a sudden it's, hey, this is Colonel Davis, G1 from the Pentagon. And immediately, first thought is like, oh, crap.
What did I do?
Statute of limitations should be up for anything, and it's very rare that you'll ever have a full bird colonel, typically reaching directly out to a staff sergeant, let alone a former staff sergeant that had been out for 2 years. And he just very quickly had me kind of identify myself and say, hey, we need you to come out to DC. We got something to tell you. I'm sitting there trying to talk to him on the phone. It's like, that's the great thing about cell phones, sir, is you can just tell me over the phone. I don't have to go anywhere. I'm working 6 to 7 days a week out in the oil fields here, and I don't know if I'll get time off. So just tell me. And he's like, no, it's something we got to do in person. I was able to talk to my boss and finally got a free weekend, and I went out there. And it wasn't until I got to DC, went to the Pentagon for the first time. They sat me down. They started giving me the brief, and as I looked down, there's 3 posters in front of me, and one's of Sal Junta, the first living recipient since Vietnam to receive the medal. The next one is Sergeant Leroy Petrie, Army Ranger, living recipient, and the third one was a Sergeant Sabo, medal, Vietnam posthumous, and it's Medal of Honor, Medal of Honor, Medal of Honor. And I just kind of remember looking down at that, kind of zoning out, just being bewildered, because, like I said, in the back of my mind when I initially got the call, said I remembered Stoney Portis told me he was going to put me in for a DSC. But really what I was thinking when I went out there is they probably downgraded it to maybe a Silver Star, and it would just be a handshake and maybe take a picture or something, and I'd jump back on the plane and fly back to North Dakota after I've done my time there and just get back to, where I left off. But then all of a sudden I'm staring at Medal of Honor, Medal of Honor, Medal of Honor. And I just kind of remember looking up and calling a timeout and asking all the brass in there. It's like, what the heck is this? Like, I got told I got put in for a DSC. Why is this Medal of Honor stuff in front of me? And they go, well, you've been recommended for upgrade. Short of the president signing your award, you'll be receiving the Medal of Honor. Like I said, I had no indication prior to that moment that there was a recommendation for upgrade. That, I mean, I didn't even, like I said, know the status of what happened with the DSC after I'd talked to Stoney Portis just a couple of days after the battle. Like I said, that was kind of the farthest thing in my mind. So it was immediately just shocking to hear that what I got credit for that day. I just thought to myself, well, that was just doing my job, and I didn't do it alone. And I had other guys there to my left and right, and I had those 8 men that gave up their life and aren't here. Like, it should have been any one of those guys. Why me?
Yeah, I think every Medal of Honor recipient I've spoken to has sort of said the same thing. I was just doing my job. There were a lot more guys who were a lot braver than I was on that day. But that's how you feel. Obviously, the review boards, the brass all the way on up, saw this as something different. And it's not just for you, right? It's really a recognition that the country wants the whole community, or all the communities which you're a part of, to be recognized in. And there are a lot of communities that look at this and say, hey, that's my guy, whether he was from a little town in Northern California or up in the oil fields of Minot, North Dakota area. It's sort of a recognition for a whole lot of people, isn't it?
Yes, it's something that, like I said, in that moment, I couldn't even begin to wrap my head around. But now it was, time has gone by, and I got to meet some of, the first Medal of Honor recipient I ever got to meet was Major General Foley. And before that, I never thought in a million years I'd ever meet a Medal of Honor recipient, let alone be acknowledged for the award. And then all of a sudden I'm meeting a retired 3-star general that was awarded his back in Vietnam. And, and that's one of those incredible things is I still remember the first piece of advice General Foley gave me. And he's like, you got to learn how to say no. Because after receiving the medal, he's like, you'll be asked to go and do a whole bunch of things, and they're really great. But he's like, you always got to make sure you're true to yourself and take time for your family.
Absolutely.
You are going to have to learn how to say no to certain things.
Well, we are certainly glad you didn't say no to Veterans Radio, Clint Romesha, today. Let me ask you to tell us a little bit about what's it like being in the White House on the day you're to receive the award. I know they put you in the back room before they all bring you out. I mean, the real world doesn't get a chance to look inside that or get a feel for that. Tell us about that day.
That day was just a whirlwind of emotions. And I mean, I can only imagine it's like a bride at her wedding day, but on steroids, right? So I remember getting to the White House and they brought me and my family in early. They gave us like a private tour and kind of gave us kind of the lay of the land on how the ceremony and stuff should be. And as we're doing that, the rest of everybody else is kind of going through the security and they're going into the room the ceremony is going to be in. And then it came time to go. They said go into the Oval Office and meet President Obama. I just remember prior to that, it's been about a decade ago. So like my youngest, he's 13 now, but at that time, I think he was 1.5. My middle daughter was, I think, 3. So of course, the back of our mind is like,
right,
not really the place you bring a 3 and a 1.5-year-old. But the White House and Michelle, First Lady and the President were just like, no, bring the kids. We want the kids. So what I remember is being in the Oval Office, sitting there kind of talking to President Obama, and he's talking to my parents and stuff. And I'm looking over and I got one kid running on the furniture and the other kid grabbing apples out of their little basket on the coffee table and just taking one bite and not liking it and throwing it back. I'm just sitting there kind of shaking my head thinking, man, the president and first lady think I'm probably one of the worst dads ever, that I got these unruly 3 and 1.5-year-old kids just acting a fool here in the Oval Office. But they were very warm and welcoming and absolutely loved it that we brought the kids with. And like I said, my oldest daughter, who's now 23, she was only 12 at the time herself. But we got done. President Obama signed my award. And then we were walking from the Oval Office to the ceremony room, kind of crossing through the lawn. And I just remember sitting there just kind of having a quiet conversation with President Obama, like, this is really weird for me. I appreciate the hospitality. And unbeknownst to me at the time, me and the president, we split to go into the final briefing room, and the rest of my family went into the ceremony room. Didn't realize it at the time. Wasn't until after the fact that my 1.5-year-old son, prior to us walking through the door, as we'd had that tour earlier, he had known there was a glass of water set behind the podium where the president was going to give a speech. So right before we came in, apparently he broke free. He was running up on stage. One of the Marines was trying to chase him down to get him out of the way of the podium, knowing me and the president were about to walk in.
And there's this great picture of it.
Yes.
There's this picture of this little dude looking at the podium. He's got his suit coat on. He's looking sharp. But that's not told in many of the stories. I've seen the picture. I didn't get, I wonder how that happened. So they finally corralled him and got him back in a seat.
Yes, they corralled him, got him back in the seat. And, the chaplain even told my family and stuff, hey, look, if Colin's my youngest, hey, he's a 1.5-year-old. If he's going to get up and just let him do it. Like, so we'd kind of had permission from the chief of chaplains. But like I said, me and the president didn't know that. So when the president's kind of giving his speech, he's talking about my son then in the Oval Office grabbing those apples. So then everybody kind of had a good chuckle because they got to see firsthand of kind of
we know what he's up to. Did a number of your Red Platoon guys get to attend the ceremony?
Yes, I think we ended up having, it was almost 22 of them that had gotten out, that were there to attend, and then I think we had another 12 or 15 that were still active, so they were able to come in on the Army side wearing their uniform. That's going back to that day. Like I said, it was just a whirlwind. There's not a whole lot of things I remember specifically about that day, other than said my kids acting a little unruly in front of the president and the first lady. The thing I do really remember vividly, though, is I remembered being up on stage and feeling just embarrassed and not. I just felt like I wanted to disappear. It was just weird to sit up there and hear all these things being talked about and all these heroics and this and that. I'm in the back of my mind, like I said, I just wanted to disappear because I was sitting there and I was thinking of Kirk and Gallegos and Mace and Hart and thinking like those guys aren't here. Why am I getting all this attention? And I'm just trying to pick a spot out on the wall that I can focus on, so I just don't totally lose it. And it comes to a moment where I remember looking straight out ahead, and in the first row was my family, my mom and my dad, my brothers, my sisters, and my kids, and right behind them was the 8 Gold Star families from the 8 and we lost. Their families were there.
Yeah.
And then just to the left was my Army family, the guys I served with that day. And I had this moment where it just kind of came over me, and it was like, damn, Clint, this really sucks, but I'm not here alone. I've got all of my family with me. And that's pretty cool.
One of the things that happens over time, I think every Medal of Honor recipient goes through this, where I'm really not worthy, even to the point of saying, I don't want to accept this award, to where the Army says, you have to accept this award. You didn't read the fine print. And the ceremony concludes, and now a decade has passed. You've probably learned a lot about yourself, the country, what it means to be a Medal of Honor recipient. As you look at this decade of having this beautiful burden of being a Medal of Honor recipient, where does that lead you?
It's reflecting on that decade of what I could tell, what I thought the Clint of 2013 knew to the Clint of 2024. Said initially, like I said, it was tough to almost overnight be recognized for something like that. And that took me a while to I wouldn't say get used to, but learn how to kind of manage and refocus that. I said, because initially it was embarrassing to sit there and why am I getting recognized when these guys sacrifice so much more? And that turned into, though, as we, coming up on especially the holidays and just got through Veterans Day, and, we'll have Memorial Day coming up here in a few months. And, we always say, never forget. We're never going to forget the service, the sacrifice. What I realized is in those 2 years I was working in the oil field, I never talked about Gallegos and Kirk to anybody. And it was like, if I'm not talking about them, I'm not letting people have the ability to never forget. So as time has gone by and dealing with that, that's what I realized. Receiving the medal gives me the opportunity to tell those guys stories that are no longer here to tell it themselves. That's been one of the greater life lessons I've kind of taken after receiving the medal, that the medal might get the attention and I might be the one wearing it, but it gives me the opportunity to shine that light, that spotlight that I don't want shown on me, but I can take that and I can redirect it and talk about the 8 men we lost, talk about issues our veterans are having today with the suicide and underemployment and lack of meaningful employment and issues with their health care and coverage to the VA. It's given me an opportunity and a platform that so many others that have worn the uniform will never get.
Can I have you comment on that, because I think or expand it. It is I haven't heard somebody point it out that way, but it creates this opportunity for you to advocate and spotlight things. And I know one of the things you've worked on is with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. It's hiring of heroes. But I suspect there are a number of those kind of causes that are close to your heart, and you say, hey, I'm going to use my little bit of notoriety here in this way. Did that take time to come around to, and where have you tried to focus?
It did. Going back to learning how to say no. because right away it's, everybody wants you to be kind of part of their organization
you didn't listen to your father, but you're listening to the Major General. Okay, I just want Dad to know that on the record. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So I mean, initially it was I realized right away I was putting way too many irons in the fire, and I felt like I was trying to do good, but since I had so many irons in the fire, that I wasn't really being effective. I said I've been an ambassador now for right around 2 years with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Hiring Our Heroes. Because for me, having meaningful employment, as we talk about the suicide issues and the struggles that veterans kind of face, the thing I've realized, it's not just one or two things that cause that. It's a whole litany of reasons, and it's not just mental health, and it's not just access to care, but it's also relationships, it's financial burdens, it's food shortages, it's all these other things. And if we can find how to improve the quality of life and give veterans hope, the result of that is a decrease in veteran suicide. And for me, especially being on with Hiring Our Heroes, to talk about meaningful veteran employment, like I lived that for 2 years before I even put the medal. I was recognized with the medal. I literally transitioned like every other veteran did. I went chasing oil fields, starting off as a low guy on the totem pole, working the wand of a hydro excavator truck. Got my CDL, started driving trucks, and then I was managing 8 of them in about a year, being up in the oil fields, because my employer, which I took for granted because I didn't know how to kind of interpret my time in the military into kind of civilian talk and what that really related to for employment. But they recognized right away the military skill sets that I brought that are kind of the intangibles that it's really kind of hard to describe them on a resume, like following rules and regulations, attention to detail, having initiative in the absence of orders. Those are the things employers are really looking for. And that made me successful after taking the uniform off when I pursued a career in the oil fields. So for me, this is one of those near and dear to my hearts, because I feel like I walk the walk, so I can tell other veterans or transitioning soldiers, that I hope I've got the credibility, because as a leader, that was always the thing I fell back on. I never, ever wanted to ask one of my troopers to do something that I hadn't already done or wasn't willing to do alongside them.
Well, I really do appreciate Clint Romesha, the time you have taken. We've run a little longer than I promised you here for Veterans Radio today to get some of these insights. You received the Medal of Honor for your actions during the Battle of Kamdesh in 2009, during the Afghan War at Combat Outpost Keating. As I said to our listeners, there's a lot of places you can learn more about the battle. I want our veteran radio listeners, Clint, to learn more about the man. So I appreciate you being willing to talk about those issues. As we close out, is there anything that you'd like to make sure that you communicate to our listeners about your experiences and being a recipient of the Medal of Honor?
It would be, here's one thing that I've taken away in the last 10 years and come to realize. I hope our listeners out there kind of listen to this message, to know that in the book of Clint and then in the book of your life, you can't rewrite any chapter that has already been written. Your past is your past, and it is going to be what it's going to be. You can always go back and you can reread it. You can reflect on it. Hopefully you can learn from it. But the only thing you can dictate now is what the next chapter is going to be. That's the one you can write. And as long as we show up to continue writing our next chapter in life, life is going to be pretty damn good.
Great advice. Clint, thanks for your time today.
Appreciate it.
And I want to thank everybody for listening to Veterans Radio today. I am Jim Fausone. It's been a pleasure to be your host. I'm a veterans disability lawyer at Legal Help for Veterans, and you can reach us at 800-693-4800 or legalhelpforveterans.com on the web. You can follow Veterans Radio on Facebook and listen to its podcasts and internet radio shows by visiting us at veteransradio.org. That's veteransradio.org. We would again want to thank our national sponsors, the National Veterans Business Development Council, nvbdc.org. Legal Help for Veterans, a veterans disability law firm with a national practice before the VA, can help you on your claims and your appeals. It can be reached at legalhelpforveterans.com or 1-800-693-4800. And PuroClean, a leader in property emergency services. It's the paramedics of property damage, providing water damage remediation, flood water removal, fire and smoke damage remediation, mold and biohazard cleanups. You can reach them at puroclean.com or 800-775-7876. We also want to thank our local sponsors. This would include the Charles S. Kettles chapter of the Vietnam Veterans of America, that's chapter 310, VFW Graf O'Hara Post 423, the American Legion Irwin Preskin Post 46 in Ann Arbor as well, the VA Ann Arbor Healthcare System, and certainly the National Vietnam Veterans of America Association. You can be a sponsor by going to veteransradio.org, clicking on the About Us and our sponsors, and help us out. Keep this program alive for the 21 and 22 years. Keep us going for another 20. Thank you.